Recording. It's great to be here today and to, or not see you, but at least know that some people are there listening and interested in the topic of AI bias. I'm going to share some slides with you, and as Claudine said, I'm going to sort of take you through a bit of a conversation around AI bias. There'll be a chance to ask questions at the end. And then Claudine, as she said, will introduce you to some of our master's programs where we teach some of the content that I'm going to be talking about. But we wanted to just start with a quick poll. And actually the second question, Claudine, I was hoping to ask at the end.
Oh, apologies.
Well, that's okay. If you could just maybe answer the first one now. Are you concerned about AI bias? Yes, no, or I don't know enough about it to have an opinion. And then we'll share the results with all of you just to kind of get a sense of what you think about it currently and how much you sort of already have considered this issue in the room today. So, oh, I get to vote as well. That's exciting. I might, I'll do that. Oh no, I can't. Can I vote, Claudine?
Not sure.
No, it doesn't look like I can. It doesn't let me submit. Are you getting other people voting?
Yes. It's coming in.
Oh, good. It might just not let me do it for some reason.
So I'm going to leave the poll open for a bit.
Great. And the second question will make more sense once you've listened to my talk. So I will share my screen. Are you seeing my slides now?
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. So I just wanted to give a little bit of an intro about myself and where I come from on this topic. As Claudine mentioned, I wrote this book with my co-author Jenny Kennedy last year, The Smart Wife, about digital voice assistants and their feminized characterization, and also the stereotypes they rely on to help us like them. And that stemmed from my work as a digital sociologist and a computer-human interaction design scholar, spanning a number of different institutions and universities. I've sort of worked in and out of various social and also technical disciplines. So I would consider myself quite an interdisciplinary scholar, certainly not on the very technical end of AI, but very much concerned with its social impacts and implications in the world. And there are a number of scholars and academics like me within the Faculty of IT, and particularly in my lab, the Emerging Technologies Research Lab, which is actually made up mainly of social scientists, but working at that intersection of emerging technologies and AI. So I sort of got interested in this topic through my own research, and my own research involves going into people's homes and having quite in-depth conversations with them about how they live and how they use various types of technology. For me, that's primarily been smart home devices, things like smart thermostats and smart energy technologies, things like voice assistants, automated appliances, those kinds of technologies. So what happened was that when I was going into people's homes and having conversations with them and their digital voice assistants, those voice assistants actually became part of the conversations, and in the transcripts, it's like they were part of the interview, because I have a little kind of, Alexa or Google Home or Siri coming up in the transcript itself. And of course, the participants in the research also referred to those devices in a very kind of human and gendered form. And it got me really interested in the gender dynamics between people and their voice assistants and the technologies in the home. So that's kind of what got my interest, and also got me broadly interested in the topic of the biases that go into the design of certain types of AI systems. And what I wanted to take you through today was a bit of an intro to kind of the broader topic and conversation around bias that's going on in the AI industry at the moment, some of the suggested solutions that are coming from that. And then I also want to just sort of provoke you a bit with some other considerations that I think are just as critical, but often overlooked when we have conversations about bias that we need to be considering in the design and programming and algorithms associated with emerging tech. Obviously, that's going to be within the context of my own research, so there'll be a bit of a voice assistant flavour going through today as well. So there's three types of bias I sort of wanted to draw our attention to. The first is unconscious bias, which are those implicit stereotypes or assumptions about certain groups of people that influence how we view and consider them. The second being conscious bias, which are very explicit sort of stereotypes. It's often considered forms of discrimination, but can also be forms of exclusion or harassment in the way that it's expressed. And then finally, and maybe most closely associated with AI, we have algorithmic bias, which are the sort of systematic or repeatable decisions that are built into algorithms that privilege one group over another and then create inequitable outcomes. So to give you a few examples of that, sort of put a few up on the screen. I mean, you'd probably be most familiar with the algorithmic bias kind of examples. We have so many of those coming through all the time in popular media. You know, I've put a couple up there. So things like detecting someone's sexuality from headshots. The problem being there that we often get that wrong, and we use particular kind of aesthetic or facial appearances to make those decisions, which don't correlate with people's actual sexuality. Determining beauty from facial data sets, of course, a really subjective thing to be attempting to put into an algorithm. Assessing employability through CVs. There's been some really high profile cases of that, like in Amazon, where women were discriminated against in the algorithms and were less likely to be recommended for jobs. Predicting criminality based on facial features. That's been often shown to discriminate against people from non-white backgrounds. There's a racial bias built into it. Assessing worker competence through micro-expressions. So again, you know, it's an incredibly complicated thing to attempt to do, but has been shown to create a bias towards people who have particular expressions on their face that may not necessarily indicate their competence or not, but maybe the result of some other, you know, some other mood or condition that they have. And voice algorithms that are more responsive to one gender or race. And there was a study that came out about this last year that showed that voice assistants are more responsive to the voices of Anglo people, and also there's been other studies suggesting they're more responsive to the voices of men. Unconscious bias, there's some examples there, you know, hiring people that look like you or that fit the sort of stereotype that you have of success, training algorithms, you know, in a kind of unconscious way on a biased sample of material or people, like without really fully considering the implications of that, or failing to consider or include the experiences or insights of a particular group of people, like older people who are often kind of just left out of technology trials. And the final one there, you know, actively discriminating against people based on gender, race or other attributes, so quite a conscious decision to exclude them, harassing people or allowing a particular view or position to inform the programming of AI. So for instance, saying, you know, we're going to have a particular, you know, position on this topic. We're not going to consider, say, one person's perspective, and we're going to do that for a particular reason. That can also be considered a form of sort of conscious bias or exclusion. So there's been sort of many reasons and discussions around why these biases occur. The main sort of one that continually comes up in the industry is the characterization of the workforce. And this is something that the AI Now Institute, which is a very prominent and credible institute coming from the US, you know, they've called this the diversity crisis. And they've looked specifically at the AI industry, finding that, you know, you can see the stats there yourselves, you know, 18% of authors are women, more than 80% of AI professors are men. Women comprise 15% of the research staff at Facebook and 10% at Google. There's actually no public data on other kinds of gender minorities or, you know, non-binary and gender diverse people. And there's also very few people who identify as Black or in Google's workforce, and also in some of the other kind of major AI organizations in the world. So what we have is essentially a lack of diversity in the industry, which has been criticised and shown to generate some of the biases and some of the blind spots, I suppose, in terms of how AI develops. This was also discussed in another major report that came out a year or two ago now from UNESCO called I'd Blush If I Could. And it was really that the report was aimed at kind of trying to address the gender gap and the gender divides that exist in digital skills, particularly in education. The name of the report is actually a phrase that Siri used to say. She doesn't anymore because we've updated her programming, but it was something she would say when she was sexually solicited or asked to asked to go on a date or asked to have sex or some other kind of sexually provocative question. And instead of responding, assertively and sort of saying, no, I don't want to do that, or, she responded with this quite flirtatious kind of response. And it was in the context of a much wider range of responses that all voice assistants at the time were being highly criticised for responding very passively and also often quite positively to sexual innuendo and sometimes also sexual abuse. And the criticism of this was that this sent a really problematic message at large to society that this kind of language and attention was okay. And even though Siri and all the other devices aren't themselves women, that it's sort of normalised and reproduced this behaviour. And so that was considered a form of a bias, in the types of responses that these devices developed. And the authors of this UNESCO report linked that back to the very male-dominated nature of the industry. There are other kinds of forms of bias. So I guess the algorithmic bias can be considered a little bit differently to that and may not only be associated with the diversity of the industry. These kinds of examples, as I said, that come up in the news all the time are often kind of almost accidental or the product of the ways in which we design algorithms and the corpuses of material that are available for us to draw on in terms of developing the algorithms and the tools that AI rely on, and also the machine learning techniques. So this, I think that there is some aspect of the industry and its makeup that comes into this, but it's also about how we actually design, program, create the kinds of tools that we develop in AI systems. So look, there's been a number of different kind of recommendations about how we broadly address these issues. And the AI Now Institute, again, has come up with some, I think, fairly strong ones that I wanted to just show you here. The first and most obvious one is really addressing that diversity crisis issue I raised before about, actively outreaching and recruiting underrepresented groups to change that and to encourage greater diversity in the industry. But their second suggestion or recommendation is around transparency. And that's making it very clear and easily accessible, what AI systems are used and for what purpose, and really publicising that and making it quite well known. And I guess that is just about kind of increasing the visibility we all have of what kind of algorithms are in use, what AI systems are in use, and how they might impact us, and also being able to rigorously assess whether they may have biases embedded within them. Which really links to their third recommendation around rigorous testing, which they recommend should occur across the whole life cycle of an AI in sensitive domains. So making sure that it doesn't create those racial or those gender biases that have become quite common. They recommend pre-release trials, independent auditing and ongoing monitoring. And unfortunately, many of these things currently don't occur in the AI industries at the moment. They also recommend wider social analysis, so going beyond sort of technical debiasing, which is very much a focus of the industry at the moment, and including, a much wider range of social analysis about how AI is used in context. And that really relates to some of my own research about voice assistants, because it's very much about the interaction with the user and the interaction in the home that generates some of the problems with those assistants, not so much about whether or not you can kind of technically change them. So it's about that testing, but also that testing in real life contexts. And as they argue, that actually necessitates a wider range of disciplinary expertise. And what we're seeing now in the AI industry is a move internationally towards more of a synergy with the social sciences and the humanities. This is also reflecting or being reflected in our degrees. I heard from our Deputy Dean of Education recently that the double degree Bachelor of Arts, which has a lot of the social sciences, and Bachelor of IT, I think it is now the one that's in most demand from industry, which really kind of tells you that there's something going on there in terms of the industry expecting and recognising the importance of this bringing together of the social implications of the technologies that we're building and releasing in the world. And also explains why the university and the faculty are hiring people like me. We also, their last recommendation there is around questioning the design. Like, do we actually need to design this algorithm to, produce recommendations on who to hire? Is that even a good idea to begin with? Or should we be actually doing something else and approaching that in a different way? And so they recommend this, thorough risk assessments to make sure that, the potential harm doesn't outweigh the potential benefits. I just wanted to mention as well, there is a lot of technical research going on, some of which I'm involved in, around how you actually deal with this. And I guess this is some of what you would learn in our degrees, the different strategies that are available to de-bias the types of systems we use. In this paper with my colleagues, we were talking about natural language generation, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. I wasn't actually until I wrote this paper with my colleagues, and how we use principles of fairness and equity to change the algorithmic processes that sit behind many of the kinds of things I've been talking about already, things like automated recruitment, recommendations, and also automated responses that come from some chatbots and voice assistants. So I just sort of wanted to, it's just a little note to say that is going on and that work is happening as well. But now I sort of just want to challenge and create a slightly different conversation around this and consider some broader things that I think are also really critical when we talk about bias, because bias doesn't only come from the creators of AI and the technology itself. It also comes from many different places. This was an example of a Twitter bot. Her name was Tay. Some of you may be familiar with her. The story is quite famous now. So Microsoft developed Tay as a sort of conversational agent that they tested out on Twitter. And within 24 hours, the experiment went pretty horribly wrong. Through machine learning, Tay started spouting, sexist, racist, anti-Semitism, you name it, all sorts of kind of verbal, horrible abuse out to the world that it had learned from its users and through targeted attacks on Twitter from specific users. And Tay was taken down pretty quickly. So the AI became incredibly biased incredibly quickly, not through the intentions of its designers, although some might say that this was predictable and that the company should have anticipated, going back to that idea of risk assessment earlier and also early testing. But it was, also a product of the people that were using it. And interestingly, Tay, or a version of Tay, wasn't called Tay, was also released in China using exactly the same, algorithms and machine learning techniques. And it didn't receive anywhere near the kind of abuse and reception that Tay did. And it ended up, I think it's now a weather anchor bot actually. So it's gone on to have quite a successful career, which shows you kind of the difference that a community or a culture maybe can make to the ways in which these biases actually eventuate. And then, there's a bigger question as well, I think, when we talk about bias, because often we blame everything that's wrong with AI on bias, but, I'm not sure that it's really the main problem. And there are many other things going on here other than just sort of unconscious or even, the type of bias that occurs because of what we just saw with Tay. That I just wanted to kind of raise with you to get you thinking about. So actually, what I wanted to do first was show you this video of to get us thinking about a bit more than bias, about a voice assistant hologram that is marketed in Japan called Azumakari. And I'm going to show you a promotional video of this particular voice assistant, just to give you a flavour of how it's been marketed and the kinds of stereotypes and gendered tropes that are coming in here in terms of the marketing of this device. I'm not sure, I know Claudine advised me to share sound, but I'm actually not 100% sure I did it. So I'm just going to stop sharing and reshare. There we go, just to make doubly sure. Is that good, Claudine?
Yep, all good.
There we go. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Let's see how I get, there we go. Move that out of the way. So maybe now it's quite obvious why Jenny and I named our book The Smart Wife, although that particular character is actually advertised as a smart girlfriend, so a slight variation, but you get the general gist. And you know, obviously it's not a unique kind of promotional video. It's representative of many similar devices that are coming onto the market as AI sort of intended to assist in the home. And, you know, whatever you might think about that particular video and the way that that is being marketed, there are a number of kind of considerations that have gone in there that, you know, we might call it a bias towards, you know, a particular type of, say, femininity, or a particular type of, you know, woman helper, or, you know, some stereotypes that are pretty obvious in there in terms of the relationship between the way that that kind of union between the man and the, in the video, and the voice assistant of coming about, you know. So you can reflect on that, and I think many other people have. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is the very sort of deliberate decisions that have gone into that, and to reflect on that as not being actually a bias, but as some deliberate design decisions. So what these kinds of traits and these kinds of stereotypes do is that they endear us to these devices. They make them likable, they make them, you know, cute, usable, familiar and comfortable. And that is incredibly important when you're a company trying to embed new technologies into people's lives and homes, you know, into their most intimate spaces. And it also helps to alleviate any concerns people might have around, you know, the fact that there is now this device in a home that's connected to a company that's maybe tracking your data, that can maybe listen to you, that maybe has a camera. So these are all kind of techniques, actually, and with a lot of research behind them, So it's not kind of a random kind of selection of attributes that are on display here, but techniques that are designed to get us to use, buy, be comfortable about sharing the data and the interactions that we have with these devices. And so I think that calling this a bias in some ways kind of dismisses or overlooks the deliberate nature of it and sort of distracts us from the bigger issue at hand here in terms of how AI companies maybe operate in terms of what it is that they're trying to do and how they do it. And of course, their interest here is getting more people to buy this device, to use this device regularly, and to build an emotional connection with it that's going to be enduring in their homes and their lives. And many companies in this space are very successful at that. So in this context, then, the sort of sexualization or the feminization of devices is, I think, quite a deliberate decision. And while it may reflect, the diversity or the lack of diversity in the industry and the biases that are there, I think there's more going on than that. So, in terms of how we address that issue, I think some of the things we need to consider are slightly different. Yes, it's about diversifying that workforce and actively reaching out to those underrepresented groups. But the other kind of parts of the puzzle, I think, shift a little bit. The transparency is more about how we expose those human decisions, where they're made, and attributing them back to a company rather than a human like AI. So typically what happens when a voice assistant performs badly or does something unexpected or is glitchy or whatever, we blame the assistant, we blame the feminized AI rather than blaming the company and asking the company, to take responsibility for the failing in that particular device. So we really have to have transparency around who's actually making decisions and the programming kind of requirements or parameters that go on to shape the experiences we have with these devices in our lives. Rigorous testing is also required across those very sensitive domains, and that's pretty much the same, in terms of things I've already discussed. In terms of wider social analysis, it's very much about here, I think, going beyond just that usability research, which is often where AI researchers stop. So in the case of voice assistants, it might be, how do we get people just to use, regularly interact with, they might be the KPIs that we're looking at in terms of the research that we're undertaking. Whereas my interest, and I think the concerns that we need to be kind of considering here, are about the broader social impacts of these kinds of technologies in the world, the way that they may reinforce or perpetuate or, alternatively, support the change in some of the stereotypes that we see, how they might advance gender equity or cultural diversity or, awareness of disability or any of those kinds of other issues that are often at the core or the concern of bias. So that involves a bit of a different research focus to what the industry has been used to and typically responds with. And finally, questioning design, again, is about, considering whether these systems should be designed at all, and to query decisions that should be human decisions and how they're made, at a kind of organisational level in terms of the types of program responses, say, that a voice system might make. So they're the kind of broader things I think we need to consider if we're looking at the bigger question of these deliberate design decisions, as well as those concerning bias. I think, okay, I just had this one final slide, just to kind of wrap it all up really in terms of what that means for AI for social good, which is actually the faculty, the mission for the Faculty of IT. And these are questions that not only I consider, but also many of my colleagues and other academics that I work with in the faculty. I think it's an ongoing question about whether it's actually possible, and various colleagues would agree or disagree with this statement, but nonetheless, we're all here trying. So I think that is an open question, and one that's fascinating to explore in a degree or in a career in this field. How do we achieve it? I mean, clearly it's not easy, and I've raised some complexities today that that throw a few spanners in the works beyond the kind of technical training and programming, kind of things that you can consider and do. What do you need to know as an AI practitioner to deal with these kinds of issues and problems? Well, again, I think that means bringing in some of the sort of social insights and complexities that we've discussed today, which we do incorporate into our degrees. And how can you consider, not just the usability of an algorithm or the usability of an AI system, but its broader social implications and ramifications in the world of the things that you build and you make, and what kinds of theories and methods do you need to actually be able to do that? Like, they're pretty big questions. And to be honest, I'm still developing those, as are many of my own colleagues and other experts in the field. And finally, I think, there's a question about how you can become an ally in this space to really increase the visibility and the understanding about the needs of underrepresented groups, and to build diverse teams, which is a challenge in itself, and is another focus of one of my roles, which is Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in the faculty. So lots to consider there, and certainly plenty to sink your teeth into if you want to do another degree, or if you're indeed grappling with some of these challenges in your own profession and career. So I will leave it there. Happy to take any questions. I think Claudine's also going to share the results of the poll. And if you haven't already, it'd be great to take that final question as well. Okay, so yes and no, and we don't have a before and after by the looks of it. So most people are concerned about bias. A few of you saying you don't know enough to have an opinion. And I can't scroll all the way down there, Claudine.
Yeah.
It looks like most people think that, yeah, both, it's equally important to consider the bias and the design decisions together, which is good to hear. I'm glad to hear you thought that even before I gave the talk.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the results, if that's okay.
Yes, and I can also stop sharing my screen. And happy to take any questions. I think someone has their hand up there. Is it Thomas?
Yeah, hi, thank you. That was a really great presentation. And that advertising video was deeply disturbing, actually. So I've just finished reading The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which is a book I'm sure you'll know. And I'm also reading Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks. And so I've really got my teeth into these issues right now. My question basically is, and this is relevant to, I'm an AI researcher actually in neuroscience. How do, in a case where perhaps the economic incentives on which these platforms are built, these structures are built, may not align perhaps with our social and cultural values a lot of the time. One, do you think AI, unbiased or valuable, perhaps socially good AI is even possible in a perhaps hostile and economic structure? And perhaps a broader question is also, how do just normal people like you and me, maybe we have our phones on us all the time and we have voice assistants in our home, how do we perhaps start attacking and dealing with these biases to protect ourselves from them? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. They're fantastic questions, not easy ones though. Look, at the first one, and I might need to get you to remind me of the second in a minute, but the first one about, how do we sort of, well, whether or not we can really have some sort of ethical or unbiased or social good AI in the world. I think that is something that many of us grapple with, certainly many academics, I would say nearly all of my colleagues actually, and would sit on a sort of spectrum as to whether or not that is indeed possible in the current economic structures. And of course, AI is being primarily developed by the biggest companies in the world, biggest in every possible sense you can imagine. So this is, is pretty heavily ingrained in our economic structure and also deeply ingrained in our lives with all of the problems that entails. So, I have, I actually vary personally in terms of where I sit on that. And in The Smart Wife, I can tell you where we got to there. I mean, halfway through the book, when we were writing the chapter about the environmental and also the sort of labour impacts of digital voice assistants, we basically were sort of like at the point where we just thought, this is all terrible, and we just shouldn't have this stuff in our lives. I think our line was, go home, Alexa, pack up your tools, Bezos, we're done. But of course, we recognised that was a completely unrealistic and, quite naive response, because these systems were so embedded and are so embedded in our lives. They were even embedded in the writing of the book and, its promotion and dissemination and everything. So we ended on a more constructive path, which was more about the kinds of tools that we have within the existing economic system to start to challenge some of the problems as we saw them, to start to move the industry in a more positive direction, although my view is that we need a far greater sort of regulatory and other forms of oversight of these industries to make significant progress in that regard. So look, that's kind of where I sit, but the problems are pretty big, and as you're reading in those great books you mentioned, and I recommend them for everyone. And actually, there's another one on my desk right here. I don't know if you've seen this one yet. Kate Crawford's got a new book out as well. That my screen thing's not working. It's the Atlas of AI. Have you come across that yet?
No, I haven't, but I'll write it down.
There we go. I put it. Oh, whoops! I didn't put it in the chat for everyone. But that's another really fantastic one. And Kate Crawford's actually the director of the AI Now Institute, who I was citing in my presentation, and so a lot of her works come out through that. I mean, she probably focuses a bit more on the environmental and the planetary impacts, but she certainly still has that equity lens as well. So yeah, I'm sorry that's probably not a very satisfying answer, but I think it's one that we're all continuing to grapple with, so you're not alone there. And look, many people within the industry are also grappling with it, as it sounds like you are. And I know there are some fantastic people working in the major kind of big tech corporations, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, who are also sort of attempting to progress things from the inside. So there are various kind of ways and means. I'm not sure how successful they all are, but I know there's a lot of work going on to try and make this AI for social good mission eventuate. And your second question, Thomas, I have now forgotten. Sorry
to hog the question time. Yeah, so basically it was from the Zuboff line of the means of social participation and the means of mass manipulation. For people who live with technology as our basic means of social participation, do you think there are any strategies that could you comment on any strategies of like how to protect ourselves from some of the worst aspects of these systems and biases?
Yeah, I mean, I've probably got some other colleagues in my lab who are probably better, who've focused on this more than I have. Jathan Sadowski is one who I would recommend you look up his work. Just pop him in the chat as well. He's done quite a lot of research in this area, although he is one of those people who probably would say, don't use it, which is not necessarily particularly helpful. One of our recommendations in The Smart Wife, again, was about having some sort of consumer code of, not a code of conduct, but what are they called, where you have like a kind of like choice where you, or a consumer guidelines, like what we have for other forms of content, like we have the PGM system and, in broadcasting, something similar to that gives people an indication before they purchase a product, ideally, what the kind of risks are that are associated with that device, what they might need to consider with regards to how their data is going to be used and the security parameters around that. So that is, I mean, that a lot of that doesn't exist at the moment. I mean, you can do your own research, but most people wouldn't, and there's no kind of consistent or credible place that you can go as a consumer like there is for some other forms of media content or some other products. So I think that is a significant gap at the moment in terms of AI and well, so many of the devices that we now have in our lives that have some AI embedded into them. So it's easy for me to say go and educate yourself, but I don't think we have really the appropriate platforms and services for people to be able to go and do that. And I'm also quite reluctant to say, you know, I really am quite careful not to put all the onus back onto the consumer or the person. I think that there's so much more that companies could do to help us understand how our data is being collected, used, and to also seek ongoing consent for that. So that if they want to on-sell something to a third party, that we're actually part of that decision rather than that being something that's completely out of our control. But also so that we understand in the first instance, you know, what is actually being collected about us, how it might be used, what the risks associated with it might be. For instance, what the risks might be of, you know, hackers or something like that, which is becoming increasingly problematic with IoT. So yeah, those kinds of considerations, I think I would put back onto the companies again to be far more transparent and to help us to understand the impacts. Does anyone, yeah, okay, we're probably running out of time, aren't we, Claudine? But how are we going in terms of questions and time?
We still have 20 minutes, and I could quickly do a presentation if there are no more questions for now. Are there any questions? So you keep your questions coming through the chat for Yolande, and I'll quickly talk about the course, a little bit about the course information for those who are interested. Okay, so I will share my screen then. All right. So for those of you who are keen to find out a little bit more about the programs that we offer, I'm going to give you a quick overview. We have 5 postgraduate programs as listed here on the slide. They're all specialist masters. So we have the Masters of Information Technology, Business Information Systems, Cybersecurity, Data Science, and AI. Now, all our programs are 2 years in length, and we do not require a cognate entry. We basically require a bachelor's degree that's equivalent to an Australian degree, of course, with at least a 60% average in your academic results. Except for AI, we need a 65% average. So the structure of the masters are all pretty much the same. It's broken into 3 parts. We have part A, which is where we teach the foundation subjects. Then we have part B, where we teach the core master study, and part C, where you have the option of doing an industry experience or a minor thesis. And it's illustrated here. This gives you a better visual. And you can see in part C is where the capstone subject is. Also, if you come in from a cognate area, then you could potentially apply for credits and shorten your program to 1.5 years. The minor thesis is where you will be exposed to a bit of research if that's the pathway that you want to go into. And the industry experience is where you will work in teams and be guided by an expert in the industry to come out with a solution to a problem related to the program that you are currently studying. Quickly going through it, the Masters of IT basically caters for students with a variety of backgrounds, as mentioned, and you can curate your degree and focus in the different areas as illustrated here. Some of our alumni in this program go on to roles such as software development, engineers, platform engineers, enterprise architects, so on and so forth. The Masters of Business Information Systems is basically for students, graduates of this program will be able to speak the language of business and the language of IT simultaneously when they finish, meaning that they can explain to managers how technology can influence their business decisions, and also can explain to IT technical people how they need to tailor their technical systems in order to meet the business imperatives of the organization. Masters of Cybersecurity, as you can see here, the key course information. The interesting part about our program is we are the first on-campus Masters of Cybersecurity program among the group of 8 universities. Our competitors, UNSW, for example, provides it online, and University of Queensland just started offering this program this year. So the only Masters of Cybersecurity in Australia to provide the most state-of-the-art knowledge in blockchain, quantum safe security, machine learning, privacy. That's our specialist area. The next one is the Masters of Data Science, and basically this is about, you know, everything to do with data, obviously, visualizing, modeling, and helping us to understand better past, present, and use the data for future as well. And last but not least is the Masters of Artificial Intelligence, and in short is really teaching the robots to perform human tasks. So we use AI every day, as Yolande has already illustrated in some of the examples. At Monash, we have researchers focusing in that area. And with that, I will just leave our handles here for you, and I will stop sharing the presentation. Thank you.
You have a question, Claudine, around transferring to the Masters of AI from the IT degree from Rowan.
Can you transfer the Masters AI from the IT degree? You can apply for credit transfer. It's just a matter of matching the subjects. The foundation subjects in part A that are illustrated, some of them are common subjects where you're doing the programming subjects. So you'll be assessed by the academics, Rohan. Was there any other questions? Can you start part-time, then transfer to full-time after the foundation units? Nathan, I don't think that it's a problem. As long as you're a domestic student, there is no issue. I believe, Jetta, if you can help me out here. I know you are from the DSR team.
Yes, Claudine, I think that would be possible. It would just be a case of checking the course mapping and making sure that that was all right with the the faculty for the progress, but I can't imagine that would be a problem.
Yeah, thank you, Jetta. I put a link earlier for calendar appointments, so feel free to book into that if you wish to speak to a course advisor. Can you start at Can you take the master's part-time in combination with other work employed as a working researcher in my case? I don't see a problem with that if you're a domestic. So no problems at all, Thomas.
That's actually how most people do their masters, I think. Was how I did mine anyway. A lot of the courses are kind of the timing aren't they like scheduled around the assumption that people will be doing other things during the day sometimes, Claudine?
Particularly for the domestic student, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm. Okay, so if there are no more questions, thank you, Yolande, for your presentation and sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you for all of you who are here and staying to the end and interacting with us as well. Please stay connected with Monash University. Reach out to us if we can help you. I will now end the session. So thank you very much.